Okay, so we talked about the color wheel last session and maybe the session before, I don't remember. Um, we introduced the color wheel. We talked about the color wheel. We very briefly talked about how it could be applied to our first palette, which was, or the first palette that included something like a primary triad. So here we have the color wheel, and the three primaries are sometimes referred to as a color triad. So we talked last week about how we could think about the first color triad we used, which was yellow ochre, earth red. This is actually more of a traditional color wheel red, and Payne's gray, right? We talked about how those three colors could be thought of as a kind of color triad. We could think of them as a color triad similar to yellow, red, blue in the traditional color wheel. So this, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, this is the traditional color wheel, right? And some people have experience with the color wheel. Maybe some people don't. But what did we say, just as a review, what did we say the color wheel shows us? Like, what do we know when or what is the color wheel meant? What information is the color wheel meant to provide for us? Can anyone say again what that is?
Primary, secondary, and complementary colors.
Yeah, primary, secondary, and I would add tertiary colors to that. So the primaries are the three colors from which, in theory, all other colors can be mixed. And I want to emphasize again that that's purely in theory. You'll find out in practice that's not true. So in practice, if you have these three colors, you can't really match any color you see. But that's in theory what the information provides for us. And it's certainly a good guide, right? It may not turn out to be absolutely true in practice, but it's a good guide for us. So the color wheel shows us the primary colors, which in a way are the fundamental building blocks of all colors. The secondary colors, which are colors that can be mixed from the primary, so orange, green, and violet. And then tertiary colors, so yellow, orange, yellow, green, green, blue, and so on. And then the color wheel is also designed to show us color opposites. So colors that are opposite from one another on the color wheel are referred to as color opposites or complementary colors. That's basically synonymous phrases, color opposites and complementary colors. And as we talked about last week, complementary colors are colors that are understood to both bring out the intensity of each other. So the idea is that if you pair a blue with its opposite orange, or a violet with its opposite yellow, we tend to see those colors with greatest intensity when they're paired with their opposites. The other way color opposites are useful, and particularly in the kind of painting we do, is that color opposites can be used to neutralize each other. So when we mix yellow with blue, at least in theory, equal amounts, we would end up with a middle gray. Same thing with orange and blue. Excuse me, did I say yellow and blue? Yellow and violet, blue and orange, green and red. Okay. So this is the traditional color wheel, and my guess is that if people have been exposed to the color wheel either before college or sometime in college, this is probably the color wheel you were exposed to. So curious if anyone knows and again, we're going to refer to these as the traditional color primaries. I'm curious if anyone knows of any other set of color triad, any other color triad set. So something like red, yellow, blue, that we can also think of as being a building block of all colors.
Light, the primaries of light.
Okay, good. And what are the primaries of light?
Blue, red, and green.
Blue, red, and green, right. So that's going to sort of, that's right. So that's actually not the one I was looking for. But can you, Morgan, explain how those primaries are supposed to function? Or how they work?
They're the primary wavelengths of light. I'm not really sure how else to.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, I'm not that familiar with the physics of light.
Yeah.
I know color, I know color as a painter. I've actually never studied color in theory. But so the primary colors of light, so the wavelengths of light from which all other colors come are actually red, green, and blue. I have that right? Red, green, and blue. And I forget what gives you yellow, maybe a mixture of red and green, but that's completely counterintuitive to us, right? Because we've always been taught, and we find out in experience, that when we mix yellow, blue, and red is how we're supposed to get all other colors. So that's true. Those are the primaries of light. But there's also another set of color primaries that have become commonly used. They actually originated with a different visual technique from painting. Anyone ever been exposed? People are gonna know it when you hear it, because we actually encounter this color triad fairly frequently. Anyone taken photo? Anyone ever done any color printing and photography? Okay. So another color triad set is magenta, cyan, and yellow. So in printing and in photography, the color primaries are magenta, which replaces red, cyan, which replaces blue, and yellow. And from these three colors, you can mix all other colors. So again, that's true in theory, but in practice, when you're actually mixing pigment, that doesn't quite turn out to be true. The color, this CMY, I think it's usually called, the CMY color primaries, from those you can mix a traditional blue, a traditional yellow, a traditional red, and then the colors in between those, so violet and so on. So today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be experimenting with these three color triads as an introduction to our full palette or full spectrum palette painting. And we're going to be experimenting with that by making color stars. So we're going to be making sort of versions of color wheels. And I'm going to demonstrate how we're going to do that. Okay. So everyone can see the screen, see the setup?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Okay, so Um, we have our colors. I have set out here our dead palette color triad. So transparent red oxide, yellow ochre, and Payne's gray. We have a traditional color triad: cadmium red medium, cadmium yellow light, and ultramarine blue. And then we have a paint equivalent of the CMY color triad: cyan, magenta, yellow. We have quinacridone magenta, which is a good stand-in for the magenta. Cadmium lemon, which is a good CMY yellow, and then we have turquoise, Gamblin 1980 turquoise. So we're going to be doing 3 color stars. I've done previously for classes, I've done a traditional color star, or a color star using the traditional primaries. So the primaries: red, yellow, blue. And a color star, I feel, works better given the time limitations of our class. So we have the yellow, red, blue, and then we mix our secondaries from that. And then we're going to mix a series of grays using color opposites. And then I have the cyan, magenta, yellow color triad. So magenta, yellow, cyan, from which we'll mix a violet, a green, and an orange. And we'll talk about how each of those color triads yield slightly different and more useful secondaries and tertiaries depending on what we're doing. And I'm going to demonstrate both how to draw out the color star, and then I'll demonstrate a dead palette color star. So, okay, so these color stars can be done on canvas paper, which I asked everybody to buy. So hopefully everybody has their pad of canvas paper. And so I'm going to walk us through how to set up the color star, and then I'll talk about painting each of those color stars. So the first thing we want to do is we want to draw out the color star. And I'm going to do a demonstration, but I have pretty explicit directions in a PDF that I'll post on Blackboard. So the first step in drawing out the color star is to establish a square within the rectangle of the canvas paper. So we want the width of this is 9 inches. So we want to measure out 9 inches across the long edge, the 2 long edges of the canvas paper. So I've measured out 9 inches on the top and the bottom. And then I'm just going to connect those 2 marks. So we have a square now carved out or laid out on this rectangle. Now what I'm going to do is along the right hand and the left hand edge, I'm going to mark off quarters or halves and a halfway point and the quarter points. So I'm going to mark off 4.5 inches, that's the half, and then 2 1/4, and 6 3/4. So I've divided that 9-inch length into quarters: 4.5, 2 1/4, and then 6 3/4. And do that the same thing on the opposite side. So I have the left hand and the right hand edge divided into quarters. And then the top and the bottom edge, I'm just going to divide in half. I'm going to put a mark, top at 4.5, and the bottom at 4.5. And that's going to serve as my guide for the color star. So the way I'm going to create the color star using those marks is I'm going to rule out a line that connects the top 2 quarter points on my color star. And then I'm going to create an inverted triangle by connecting the top corner with the bottom center point. I'm going to do the same on the opposite side. So I'm starting with a triangle, an inverted triangle. And then I'm going to overlap that using my guide, the marks along the perimeter as a guide. I'm going to overlap that with another triangle. So I'm actually creating a kind of Star of David. So then I'm going to make a little cross right in the middle of my color star by connecting the halfway points on the top, bottom, and 2 side edges. And I'm going to use that as a guide to create a circle right in the middle. So I have a compass that I can do this with. And if you have a compass, you can certainly use a compass. But if not, you can eyeball it if you want. You can also do something like get a little, get like the lid of a bottle, like a lid of a bottle of iced tea or something like that. If you want to have a perfect circle in the center. So that's where our gray is going to go. And then I'm going to create these pie wedge shapes by connecting each of the low points on the perimeter of the star. So moving across from one side of the star to the other. I'm just going to again connect to these low points. So now I have a star to begin my painting with. So here's our traditional color primaries, right? So we have yellow, red, blue. So yellow, yellow, red. And blue. So we have primaries that what we call the dead palette triad. So a version of these color primaries. So yellow ochre, transparent red oxide, and Payne's gray. And then we also have our CMY primaries. So cadmium lemon. I may not have asked you to buy cadmium lemon. Did I ask people to buy that?
I don't think so.
Cyan, magenta. Yeah, I'm sorry, yellow, magenta, cyan. So we're going to be following, following the basic layout of the traditional color wheel in the form of a color star, yellow, red, blue, for all three color triads. So all three color primary sets. For the traditional color primaries, which we see here, for the CMY color primaries, cyan, magenta, yellow, and for the dead palette primaries. So I'm going to do the dead palette primary. So I'll start with just laying out the colors I'm going to be using. So I'm going to be using our transparent red oxide, which is our red.
Professor,
Yes.
I just wanted to tell you I left the room when you took attendance. I just wanted you to know I'm here.
Okay, I got you. So I'm gonna just add a little bit of white to this, just so its color is more apparent on the screen. So we have this earth red. So that's our red in this color triad. And then we have yellow ochre. And we have Payne's gray or blue black as our blue. So I'll add a little bit of white to that, again, to show a little bit more clearly. Its color. And might as well just show. The reason we can think of this as a kind of blue, so that on your screen and just working here in the studio, this appears to be just black. And then when I mix it with white, it just appears to be a kind of standard gray. But if we put out ivory black, as opposed to blue black, and then mix it with white, I think you'll see, it's worthwhile showing this. I think you'll see how that's the Payne's gray. I'm gonna mix with white. And then I'll mix ivory black with white. And so you can see how much bluer, at least I hope you can, yeah, you can. You can see how much bluer the Payne's gray is than the ivory black, right? So the ivory black, the gray of the ivory black, it reads much warmer. And when they're next to each other, you know, that could almost come off as a kind of violet as opposed to this blue. So that's just something you want to start becoming aware of if you intend to, if any of you intend to continue painting. You want to start to become more aware of how these individual colors work in reality. So Payne's gray is just kind of blue-black, and it's very useful in certain contexts. Okay, so we're going to create a color star using just these three colors, just by way of a demonstration this morning. So this is now very, very simple, right? So we're just going to be going through the process of laying down our primaries, and then mixing secondaries based on the primaries. And then we're going to mix grades. So I'm going to start laying down the primaries with yellow. And so, very simple. I mean, this is not a complicated process we're going through. I actually used to be concerned that people would find this to be very boring. They would dread this class session, but I'm not guaranteeing this for anybody, but I have found actually that people find this to be a relatively relaxing activity. So I think it's best I think you get the most out of this if you try to do this as neatly as possible. Although you're not going to be graded on neatness, you know, unless someone just clearly does a very fast job where they're clearly not thinking about the process. But that's something that I'd like people, as you're doing these color stars, I would like people to bear in mind. So in other words, what I mean by that is, so don't just fall into a kind of automatic process where you're not thinking about the implications of what we're doing. So the reason it's useful to think about this range of colors we're using in terms of, or to really think about it as you're going through this process, I hope I'm explaining this in a way that makes sense, is you want to start to become aware of how different, not only different colors, so reds, yellows, blues, and so on, but also different pigments work. So as you're doing this dead palette color star, really pay attention to the specific characteristics of these different hues or different colors that the dead palette primaries, so dead palette or Spanish palette primaries, think about the different characteristics that these primaries yield, or the characteristics of the different colors that these primaries yield. So I think you'll find that the colors you can get with, let's say, the dead palette primary, and you'll see it'll be obvious that the colors are different. And you'll find that those different colors may be more useful than other colors at certain times, and depending on both what you're painting and what you're trying to do with your painting. In other words, what kind of painting you're trying to create. And that may mean exactly what mood you're trying to create, or you might think that a certain palette is more appropriate to a certain subject matter or a certain narrative, or what's sometimes called the conceptual content, in other words, the idea behind your painting. So in this class, we are primarily doing technical exercises, but you want to start thinking about how these technical skills are going to start relating to ideas you have or the specific content or meaning of the paintings ultimately you'll be making. So as with each of the color triads, we'll be making a color star 4. You want to start with the 3 primaries. So any questions so far? So again, our Spanish palette or dead palette version of yellow, red, blue. These are going to be the primaries here that we start with. Okay, so now we're going to mix our violet, or what we can think of as a violet. So I'm just going to mix our Payne's gray and our transparent red oxide. Now, if I put this color down, doesn't look that different on your screens. I'm going to put a little bit of white in it. And people can do this if they want. If you want to add a little bit of white to a color you're mixing, in order to bring out, to just make it clearly a little bit different from the other colors that you have down. Your color star, that's fine. And so this is not, on this camera, you're not going to pick up a great deal of difference, but you'll see it in your, when you do your color stars. Now, so when we think of the traditional color wheel violet or the even more intense CMY violet, this certainly doesn't seem like a violet. This seems, I think we would more typically call this a brown. But again, I think it's very useful to be able to think about color in ways that are a little bit more complex than just giving them the kind of everyday color name we would usually assign. So this could be, depending on depending on the specifics of the painting you're doing, you might need a kind of violet brown. And so it's good to know that you can get it potentially, this isn't the only way to get it, but potentially using a mixture of these two colors, an earth red and a blue black. And we're going to be making our other secondaries, so a version of an orange and a version of a green that are like this violet, also quite muted and subtle. But again, those kinds of muted and subtle colors can, depending on what your intent is, can be extremely useful. So I'm going to make my dead palette orange. I'm mixing transparent red oxide and yellow ochre. So we now have our 3 primaries, 2 of our secondaries. And so we're going to make now our green. So I'm going to take Payne's gray and yellow ochre. And I think when we see that, and again, I don't know how clearly you make that out. So this mixture, in the context of these other colors, reads as a kind of olive green or an army green. Bring it up a little closer to the camera. And so if you compare, and I think you can see it on the camera, if you compare this gray to this gray, this is a more violet gray, and this is a more green gray. So in a sense, this palette yields grays, but grays that each have different characteristics. And these, again, all of these nuances of color are colors that may be very useful to you in different circumstances as a painter. And as we're going forward in the semester, try to be thinking of these colors as you're mixing them and putting them down. Not exactly committing them to memory, but just being conscious of what is the color you're making. So this is a kind of warm yellow gray, which is another way of saying a kind of green, kind of muted green. And as we're looking at colors that we're painting throughout the rest of the semester, you might want to think back to some of these colors as perhaps starting points, or perfectly good versions of the color you want to mix, again, in a specific circumstance. Okay, so now we could, and sometimes you'll see color stars that also include the tertiary colors. So we could actually lay another color star on this one, overlap another one, and make our secondaries here. So a yellow orange, an orange red, a red violet, and so on. And people can do that. I suspect people won't, but people could do that if you wanted. But just given the time constraints and what I'm trying to get out of these assignments, we won't do that in this. We're just going to do our primaries and then our secondaries, or our versions of those. But what we are going to do, and I think an important part of color wheels for us, is we're going to mix a series of grays moving towards a middle gray. So if people remember, in theory, you can get a middle gray by mixing color opposites. So if I mix violet and yellow, I get a middle gray. If I mix violet and yellow, that's as much as saying when I mix the 3 primaries together, right? Because if I'm mixing yellow with violet, violet's made of blue and red. So I'm really mixing red, blue, and yellow. So I'm mixing the primaries. So we can think of complementary colors as arriving at a middle gray, but we can also think of the 3 primaries mixed together as neutralizing each other and arriving at a middle gray. So we're going to mix a middle gray using our primary colors. And so people often ask me, can I just use black and white to do this? And the answer for this assignment is no. You want to see how mixing the primaries can get you a middle gray. So we're going to try to get as close to a middle gray as possible just by mixing primaries. I'm going to put white into this so that we bring it to kind of middle gray. And that's my first start at the mixture. And this to me looks a little bit too yellow. So I'm going to put a little bit of blue black. And so that's that color. I think people can see it there. It's a little bit too green for me. So I'm going to neutralize that green with its opposite. Right? So if that gray is a little bit too green, I'm going to put a little bit of its opposite in there, which is red, to see if I can just neutralize that a bit. So here, looking at the color again, it hasn't changed that much. It's a little bit warm. So I'm going to put a little bit of blue black in it again, just to cool it down a little bit. It's a little warmer than I think the middle gray should be. And in my opinion, for these exercises, we're not shooting for some absolute standard. It may be a useful thing to do. But what we're trying to do is just get as close by eye as we possibly can. The reason I don't say that because I think it's okay to be sloppy in doing these exercises, but you'll find that when we are mixing paint, so when we're actually mixing physical pigments, it's very difficult to achieve any kind of exactness in color mixing. And I don't think it's necessary. So we're getting as close as we can by eye. I think that's good enough for our purposes. So I think we have a pretty decent middle gray. So in other words, it's not terribly more warm than it is cool. It's not distinctly more green than it is red, not distinctly more violet than it is yellow, and so on. And you want to do exactly the same thing with the other primaries. And it's a little bit tougher to get a middle gray with the more chromatic primary sets, with which you'll be doing the other color stars. But you can approximate it. So to get as much out of this assignment as possible, you want to genuinely try to mix that middle gray using your 3 color primaries. So, and to explain a little bit more what I mean by the issue of exactness, there's such a difference between theory and practice when it comes to color, or in other words, the idea of what colors are supposed to do and what actually happens when you're dealing with actual pigments. There's a huge difference. So remember, we said that in theory, we've always been taught that if you have yellow, red, and blue, you can get any color. But the fact is, with these specific pigments, they just don't work that way. That's true in theory, and it's true with light. So with the color primaries of actual light, those color primaries interact in such a way that all other colors are created, at least all other colors that we can perceive. But it's simply not true when you're using pigments. So in theory, the 3 color primaries give you a middle gray. And in theory, the CMY color primaries get you a middle gray. So that should suggest to us that this middle gray and this middle gray can be exactly the same. But it's very difficult to use these 3 primaries and make a middle gray, and these 3 primaries and make a middle gray that's exactly the same. Right? In theory, a middle gray is an absolutely neutral. In other words, it's absolutely halfway between black and white on the value scale, and it's neutral in the sense it doesn't tend more or less toward any color. But you simply can't get an exact middle gray using these same color primaries. At least I can't. So we don't need to be absolutely scientifically exact. We simply want to go through the process of trying to get there so that you can see how different colors work with each other, how different pigments interact. So what we're going to do now is we're going to, again, moving from our primaries, yellow ochre, transparent red oxide, and blue black, to this color triad, and our secondaries, our version of green, our version of violet, our version of orange. Now we're going to take these primaries, or the primaries and the secondaries, and mix a series of grays between them. So let's just start with our yellow and our violet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take yellow, and I'm going to mix a little bit of violet with it. I'm going to make a transitional gray here. So I'm going to take my yellow, and I'm going to mix it with a little bit of the violet to start to progressively neutralize my yellow. So I have a slightly grayer yellow moving towards our middle gray. So just I just want, I guess I just ask people to really pay attention to what I'm saying, because this is, I mean, you can certainly ask me later, but this is the part of the color star that tends to confuse people the most, like exactly what colors are used to fill in the interior pie wedges. So again, what we're doing is we're taking our primaries and mixing them with the color opposite to create grayed down versions of each color. So I've taken yellow ochre, the yellow in this color star, and I've mixed yellow ochre with a little bit of its opposite. And its opposite is our version of violet. And I've made a slightly more violet, slightly more violet, and therefore slightly grayed down yellow. Now these colors, I think you'll see, or what we end up with, are colors that could be very useful when we're mixing things like the colors of shadows or the colors of halftones. So this may be a color that would be very useful for a base for the shadow side of a yellow object. So again, I just would like to ask people to just really try to remain conscious and observant of what colors you end up mixing and how they might be useful. So again, to get that interior pie wedge, I took our yellow and I added its opposite, our violet. Now to get this pie wedge next to the violet, I'm going to take violet and add a little bit of yellow to that. So this color is mostly yellow with a little bit of violet. This color is going to be mostly violet with a little bit of yellow. So you want to make sure that the colors, the grays that are coming off of color opposites are slightly different from each other. So this the gray that's next to the violet should be a little bit different than the gray that's next to the yellow. Even though we've used the same colors to get them, you want to make them a little bit different from each other because of the slightly different percentages of each color. So does anyone have any questions about this? Is the way I am arriving at these interior colors, is that clear to everybody? So let me know if it is not. And now I'm going to go around the color wheel and do the same with all of my colors. So I'm going to take my orange, and I'll mix up a little bit more orange. And I'm going to mix my orange with a little bit of its opposite, which is the blue-black or the Payne's gray. And I'm going to make a slightly gray, slightly darker orange. Now, you want to, one thing you do want to make sure to do is make sure the interior pie wedges, each is different from the one next to it. So I have a grayed down orange. Again, thinking about this color, like how might this color be useful to me going forward? My studio neighbor is playing their radio. Can people hear that in the background? Or do you not hear that?
I can hear it a little bit, but it's really faint.
It's not distracting.
No.
So this is, so I know the camera doesn't pick up subtleties, but I just want to try to, so I mixed up the gray yellow, and I just want to make sure that the gray orange next to it is different. This is a little bit, this gray violet is a little bit close to this. So I will adjust that. First I'll get the other colors down, but I want each of those interior wedges to read as different from the one next to it. So it's trickier with this color wheel. So with getting the middle gray is easier with this series of color triads than the others. But getting the interior grays to be different from one another is easier with these color triads. So here the interior grays are clearly different from one another. It's a little bit more tricky here. So I'll now move on. Well, let me move on actually to my gray blue. So I'm going to take my blue and mix orange with that. So far, okay. Okay, and then my last two color wedges. So I'm going to take my green and I'm going to mix a little more green. And I'm going to make a gray version of the green by adding red. Now again, we're getting colors. We're calling this a gray green. But it appears to us, if we're thinking about just everyday color concepts, this appears to us to be a kind of brown. But a brown is a kind of gray green. Or for that matter, we can think of certain gray blues as a kind of brown. But that's still very useful to know how these different colors can be made, how they come about. And it can be very useful to be able to think about browns as being on the green side or the red side. Again, that's a useful way to think about color when you start to get into complex color mixing. And now I'm just going to use that same puddle just to neutralize my red a bit, so that I'm using that green to make a slightly neutral red. Again, I just want to make sure that it's a gray or neutral that's different from those it's next to. Sarah, you and I are meeting right after class.
Yes, if you're still available, then yeah.
We'll be ending a bit early today, so.
Okay.
Oh, but did you want to meet too? Tova's taking a break. Okay, so I have my color star at least blocked in. Now I say blocked in because, again, I do want these interior wedges to be different, distinctly different from one another. So to me right now, this yellow, this gray yellow, and this gray violet look a little similar. So I'm going to, I want to make my gray violets a little bit different from the gray yellow. So I'm gonna just mix a little bit more violet into this. I want it to be different from the gray yellow and also different from the colors around it. I think that's better. Okay. So again, starting with our primaries, yellow, red, and blue. So Payne's gray, transparent red oxide, yellow ochre. Mixing the secondaries by combining those colors. And then mixing a middle gray, finding that middle gray by mixing the three primaries together. And then progressively graying or neutralizing each of the colors around the edge of the color star by mixing a little bit of its opposite. So I grayed down my yellow by mixing a little bit of violet. I grayed down my blue by mixing a little bit of the blue-black into it, and so on. And for the assignment will be to do the same thing with each of the color triad sets. So what you're going to do is you're going to make 3 color stars. The first color star will be, or you can do it in any order you want, but let's just go from traditional to CYM. So the first color star is going to be the traditional red. So that's on the paints I ask people to buy, that's either cadmium red medium or primary red. Traditional yellow, so that's either cadmium yellow light or primary yellow. And then your traditional blue, which is ultramarine blue. So notice here on the color star, I mixed a little bit of white with the ultramarine blue to create a little bit more of a traditional primary blue. And you can do that. You can mix a little bit of white with your blue or any color where you feel like that's necessary at all. And then you're going to do a color star using the CYM primaries. So magenta, cadmium yellow light, and turquoise as the color primaries. And then 1 color star using the dead palette or Spanish palette primaries. So transparent red oxide, yellow ochre, and Payne's gray. So can I clarify anything about what I'm asking people to do? Is everything clear about that assignment?
And you want the star to be the same shape as yours?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there are innumerable, well, that's not quite true, but there are many versions of a color wheel. So, I mean, I'm not sure why you asked that, Tova, but if you really want to do another shape for the color wheel or the color star, just send me an example. It's probably fine, actually. This to me is just, I find it to be the easiest way to create a usable color, color wheel or color star.
Yeah, I was just curious.
Yeah. Any other questions? So everyone, I just want to make sure everyone's clear on how you're going to arrive at the grays in the center and the middle gray in the middle of the color star. Okay. So like I said, there are going to be very clear instructions posted on Blackboard. So I'll upload this demonstration. I'll upload images of the color stars, labeled images of the color stars. I have a PDF that walks you through very clearly how to plot out your color star. So I think all that information will be available. Certainly if anybody has any questions, you're always feel free to email me. This past week I had a family issue I had to deal with, so I wasn't as prompt in getting back to people as normal, but that won't be the case going forward. Okay, so that will be the assignment. I think next week we're on spring break, right? Yes. So
Sorry, is it due next week because spring break starts?
no, it's due the week after spring break. So it'll be due the first Wednesday we get back.
And you want us to do all three, correct? All three stars. Okay. Perfect.
Okay. Okay, so we're ending early today. Of course, you can use the time until 1:50 to do work on the color stars if you choose. Obviously you don't have to. I will be available until 1:50 today. If anyone needs to get in touch with me, any questions about this, feel free. And if there aren't any other questions, then we'll end early. I'm going to stay on to meet with Sarah. And Tova, did you want to meet? I know you had some.
Yeah, I did.
Okay, so can you, why don't I meet with Sarah first?
Okay.
And then can you just sign back on in about 15 minutes?
Yeah, perfect. Sounds good.